Thank you so much for the introduction and good to be back. Yeah, just wait a couple of minutes. A few people might drop in. Yeah, it's a bit odd, but okay, everyone can see that. All right, so the talk today is going to be on, as it says, pawning cyber physical systems. We're going to talk about operational technology, specifically OT cyber kill chains, and in the context of modern automation and everything moving cloudwards, how they can be short-circuited. And I'm actually going to walk you through some of my experiences from the field. Pen testing, specifically power and energy, power plants. Yeah, I'm going to walk you through the stuff I've done and showcase a bit of that work. Obviously, a lot of details are going to be scrubbed because these are actual things that have happened. Um, how many of you out here into OT security? I see Naveen there. Anyone else? All right, cool. So, perfect. Um, All right, let's get started. I think people have joined. So, cool. A bit of an introduction. My name is Karan. I'm basically a programmer, hacker, and by virtue of those two, an entrepreneur of sorts. Um, yeah, I've got a bit of experience in operational technology, specifically power and energy generation, transmission, distribution. A lot of work on the enterprise side as well, everything from offense to designing defensive architectures to incident response, work with government law enforcement. So a lot of stuff over the years, but all in the deep end of technology. I'm not on the compliance or the paper pushing end of things. Um, Huge advocate of cybersecurity education, open source all the way, and I'm also a musician. So, uh, yeah, I've got experience with thermal, renewable energies like wind, hydroelectric dams, solar power, all pretty high impact systems. When for example, if you compromise a dam and you uh, get access to open the floodgates, consequences can be pretty huge. Likewise, with any of these things, you could actually compromise the safety. Not so much solar. I don't think you could compromise safety, but you get the idea. So what are we going to be doing today? I'm actually going to be talking about cyber physical systems and the cyber kill chain, the ICS cyber kill chain. Does anyone know what the kill chain is, a cyber kill chain? You guys might have heard of it. Naveen knows. Anyone else? The term kill chain, have you heard of it? Okay, so a kill chain is basically a series of events that needs to take place successfully in order for an attack to be considered a success. Now, in the enterprise world, we all know what a kill chain looks like. It starts out with reconnaissance, which is your OSINT. You sort of figure out what the target looks like from the outside as much as you can from, at least from the inside. Of do some research on their tech stack, the people, a bit of social engineering, all of that. And then you go towards your first phase of initial access, which could be like a phishing email, or you might exploit a public facing service, so on and so forth. You gain persistence, pivot, blah, blah, blah. So the ICS skill chain is basically this skill chain, but in the context of an OT environment, and OT being, it's basically operation technology. For those of you not familiar with the term, I'm sorry, I've just been throwing it around. OT stands for operation technology, IT is for information technology. The paradigms for information security in both these domains are slightly different. In IT, we've got confidentiality, integrity, availability. This is something you've all heard, right? CIA, the CIA triad. So confidentiality, integrity, availability on IT. On OT, it's safety and then availability. want to keep people safe and you want to keep these systems available. And they have to be available because you can't really drop the power grid or water or whatever. So I'm going to define critical infrastructure out here. So critical infra, for to define it super simply, it's the infrastructure that supports us as a society. It stuff like power and energy, banking, financial services, healthcare, the utilities like water, all of that. It all comes under critical infra. And critical information infra are the information networks that are used to support this infrastructure. And um, why is power so important? It kind of sits at the core. It sits at the base of all of these critical infrastructures. You pull the lights out of the equation and everything goes down, right? Your banking, your finance, hospitals. Sure, there's power backup, but that's finite. You cut energy and you bring a nation to its knees. So energy is a huge target in modern warfare. Whenever countries have problems with each other, they seldom fire missiles and bullets nowadays. It's always the first line of attack is in the cyber domain, and critical infrastructure is always a huge target. And we've seen that recently. In the events that occurred last year with Russia, Ukraine. India has had a couple of incidences. There's stuff like this all over the world. A lot of it is reported, but most of it is not. So, yep, energy is a huge role. Um, and yeah, back in the day, in order to pull off, some sort of sabotage or espionage, people did it, but it required, teams going behind enemy lines and, getting in there, infiltrating. You'd had sacrifice of teams and human life. Today, it's a lot easier. It's usually when they say a nation state actor, it's usually a bunch of 4 to 5 smart people sitting in a room at some end of the world. And these are publicly documented case studies of stuff like Energy Bear and all these groups that were targeting power and energy. So you could read about them. They're pretty interesting. How they've worked and how they've sabotaged different sort of power OT systems. Okay, now diving a little more into the technical side of things. Who's heard of the Purdue model? The OT guy, Naveen. Okay, who else? Anyone else? The Purdue model? All right. So the Purdue model, to put it really simply, is just a way of defining how OT networks are segregated. All right. The outermost layer would be level 5. That sort of interfaces with the public world and the internet. That's your typical enterprise network. It sits behind a firewall and a DMZ. And then you've got your enterprise network, which contains the normal people who are running, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, doing all the regular office functions. Below that, you've got another DMZ. And DMZ is basically like a demilitarized zone. It's a sort of neutral ground between a slightly more open network and a more secure network. I don't know if that definition is right. It sounded horrible, but basically it's a sort of zone between the bad stuff out there and your sanctified inner network in here. Very practically speaking. So you've got manufacturing at level 3, and typically you've got some more firewalls, and then level 2, 1, and 0 are where it's at. Okay, these are that's where the physical processes are. So you'll typically see on your enterprise network and manufacturing zone, it'll be systems that are mostly familiar to you. You'll have computers running, regular office software. Manufacturing zone, you'll find some specialized systems, but it's still more or less computers running Windows mostly, sometimes Linux, and databases, stuff like that. Level 2, 1, and 0, you start seeing different types of systems. Yeah, these are systems that control physical processes. So stuff like PLCs, HMIs, RTUs, and of course level 0, which are devices that are actually the physical process. So pumps, actuators, relays, valves, all of these things which actually govern physical processes. In a chemical plant, it could be moving, gallons of chemicals from one tank to another, starting up a furnace, spinning up a turbine, and super important, right, that the security of these systems is taken care of, because when you hack this, You're not stealing a bunch of credit card details, yeah? You're blowing stuff up. Because very often, cyber physical attacks, the goal of it is to purely compromise human safety and human life. You know, um, he brought up yesterday the Trisis malware, which was detected in 2017. And anyone heard of this malware, Trisis, apart from Naveen? Anyone else? Okay, it was the first time malware was publicly discovered and released, which had only one goal, and that goal was to take human life. Okay, the malware was designed to override certain safety systems and compromise the security of a petrochemical plant to release a very toxic gas to kill human beings. So, OT systems compromise, huge, huge impact. So, anyway, these are the levels of the Purdue model. And the ICS kill chain talks about a series of events that are necessary to gain control over level 2, 1, and 0. So we're going to talk about that. So yeah, stage 1 looks pretty much like a normal cyber attack. You've got your planning, which is your reconnaissance. You've got your preparation, which is your weaponization and targeting. So you figure out where the weak links are. You figure out who has access. You know, there's an IT admin there who's got the keys to the kingdom. He loves, perhaps libraries. You want to fish the guy, pretend to be a library, for example. Send him something, he clicks on a link, boom, you've got access on his machine. That's your initial attempt, your delivery exploit. All fairly standard for enterprise kill chain. Um, you got to get a bit sticky inside the network, so you enable a channel of command and control, C2, and then you sort of start another level of reconnaissance. So a lot of the popular OT attacks, which are again documented in the public domain, they involve threat actors sitting at this stage for sometimes up to 2 years. Yeah, they sit inside the network and they just start studying. They read all the documentation. They figure out what's going on, who's who, what kind of processes are running below. So it's a lot of study. And during this time, they very often set up a lab which emulates the actual plant that they're targeting. So you figure out what devices are there. So this takes a lot of time, study, diligence, and money, which is why you'll find these threat actors are often nation state funded because they've got all the time and all the money. At this point, you start developing exploits for the lower level, which is the stage 2. So attack development tuning, you set up your lab, you figure out how to, pawn the lower layers of that Purdue model, and then you deliver your ICS attack. You cross that DMZ into the lower layers, fix yourself on machines that have control over the physical process, and then you sort of execute the attack. Now, what are the goals of an ICS attack? Typically, it's to compromise the physical process with the ability to re-attack with high confidence. Now, this is kind of, this picture was taken from the SANS Institute. Um, that's the difficulty. So the outer rings are relatively easy to achieve, and as you come towards the center, it's really, really difficult. It's very, very difficult to compromise physical processes with a successful re-attack option. But you can see stuff like, exfiltrate information and things like that, which are slightly easy, but it's still difficult. Okay, attackers have to get a lot of things right in order to make this happen. That kill chain is not small, it's long. When you start out from the beginning of reconnaissance to getting a foothold and going down deeper, it's actually pretty difficult. And now I'm going to talk to you about an experience of mine where, I kind of reached somewhere out here where it was not so difficult. And why? Because stuff is being connected to the cloud nowadays. Everyone wants to optimize things. They want to look at their power plant from their home. I don't know. But literally stuff like that. Yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and talk about it. Yeah, so these are attacker objectives typically. So loss is a loss of view, loss of control. Denial would be denial of view, denial of control, or denial of safety. And manipulation, again, manipulation of view, control, safety, sensors. These are the typical goals you set out when you're attacking a piece of OT or a power plant, yeah? So, um, yeah, this is an experience that I went through maybe, I think, last year, if I'm not mistaken. I was tasked with penetration testing a power plant. I'm not going to disclose the exact location of it. That's just a stock photo from Google. So don't think of doing geo-OSINT. You'll end up with with a stock photo. So yeah, it was a pretty large power plant in the hundreds of megawatts. And if you guys know about solar, that's pretty large for a solar plant. It spans many, many, many acres. Because of that, because of the large geographic spread, the ICS, the OT systems, don't always communicate over wires, you know. Normally these OT systems, they'll communicate either over a serial link or a serial link encapsulated in TCP/IP, in which case it would be over copper, or on long distances, optic fiber. But when the distances get really long, you find stuff going across radio. And yeah, for those of you who were here yesterday, you know I'm hosting the radio hacking village out there. And radios are hackable. So yeah, the task was, okay, this thing has been secured. We want to see how secure it really is. Come in, bring your team in and see how bad it is, you know, how far can you get access. So I spent about a week, and I started studying the manuals, you know, figuring out what devices were there on the inside. A lot of devices of ABB, a very good company that builds solar inverters and PLCs and many other industrial components. So read the manuals, read the technical specifications, spent a week just studying. And all of this is public domain info. In fact, if you go to the CVE the NIST website, you'll find my name there, you know, acknowledged for helping secure their customers and stuff. So none of this is, you know, not out there in the public domain. So anyway, I figured out that these were the inverters, and the thing that caught my eye is ABB's cloud-connected three-phase string solution. I was like, this is a cloud-connected solution. So I just went on a tangent there. This was during one of the lockdowns. I believe it was a Saturday evening. Nowhere to go out, so, you know, poured myself a nice single malt, and I'm like, okay, let's see what this cloud-connected thing is about. Started poking around, did a bit of OSINT, figured out the servers where the cloud thing was happening. It was on a cluster somewhere in AWS, you know. So I started poking at the application and figured out it was a power plant portfolio management software. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting. We've got a software out there that manages portfolios of power plants, and it's a web application, so how good is it? Now this was out of my scope, so I had to take a call, you know, whether to do it or not. And I thought, okay, in the interest of public safety, let me just take a stab at it. So I started stabbing around, and I started reading the manuals. Now, the funny thing about a lot of these OT components, whether it's like PLCs or web applications or RTUs or whatever, they have to release the entire technical specification to the public. So that means you're already armed with a lot of ammo you need. You know, you can just read it all. If you have the money, go ahead and buy the device, dump the firmware, reverse engineer, do whatever you have. You can easily figure it out. It's not rocket science. So anyway, while reading the manual, I realized that, damn, this thing can read everything about like firmware. You know, basically now you're going down to that lower level of the Purdue model. These are like field devices. So I was like, I have to get access to this. You know, it's a Saturday evening. I have nothing better to do. This has to happen. And so I poked around enough, and, you know, it turned out it happened. Managed to break the API, and these are the obfuscated details which it was leaking. There's the firmware version, serial number, Modbus device IDs, field IDs, voltage that the thing was currently giving out at the time, and GPS coordinates, everything out there. And I was like, holy shit, this is for real. And there were thousands of these power plants out there. So, I immediately contacted the people that contracted me, and I'm like, hey guys, this is the scene. They were like, okay, take it up with the manufacturer. So I called ABB. They were like, oh, we've sold this product to Fimer. So I've called up Fimer. It's a weekend, it's Saturday, and the Italians love their weekends. So this guy was like, you give me till Monday. I told him, no, I'm not giving you till Monday. You need to look at this shit right now. And he's like, okay, okay. So he looks at it and he's like, okay, holy shit. So what I sent him was, I basically took out all these details. I wrote a Python script to do that. It took a while to do it because it involved automating a lot of Google docking, brute forcing, showdowning. It was a complex process to put this together. I had to bypass a lot of AWS's WAF features. But eventually it worked out. And what I put together was something like this. Just give me a second. I'm going to pull up this video. Yeah. So to put the point across, I sent him this. I basically wrote a script which created a KML map, stuck it on Google Earth. I'm like, cool, I've got read access to this many power plants. And then he was like, okay, I'm going to look at it. But yeah, KML is awesome, especially when you're mapping targets. It's really good. You can import it into pretty much every mapping software. So yeah, you can see everything from like parking lots to high schools to large-scale power plants to, yeah, these were all solar because, it was a solar inverter that got me here. But why is this a problem? I mean, it's only read access. I can see the firmware, I can see the voltage, I can see all of this. It's a problem because you've already got past a lot of that ICS kill chain. You've got to the stage where you're doing reconnaissance at level 2, level 1 of the Purdue model. And once you know the exact details of a piece of firmware, it is pretty easy to get your hands on the firmware and then start to reverse engineer it. And typically, firmware has bugs in it. And once you figure that out, then life is easier if your goal is to exploit stuff. So anyway, yeah, I put this on Google Maps, sent them the video, and they were pretty good. They jumped into action within 2 weeks. It was secured. They had put a notice out to NIST, and because there were thousands of power plants in every continent, so the governments needed to know. And they closed off the bug. And after this, I poked at the application a little more, found a few more bugs. They sort of sorted that as well. This was not within my scope. It was just a weekend, with with nothing to do. But at the end of the day, it's good if you have the option to go out there and secure people and society. Why not, right? The power out here in these lights, do you know when it was generated? Anyone? Whatever's lighting up our room right now, when was this power generated? Come on, don't be shy, just throw an answer. Could be a wild guess. Yesterday? Now. So we don't yet have the technology to store power, okay? We don't have the technology to store it. Elon Musk might, but for large cities, he's absolutely right. Power is burnt the moment it is generated, the very same second. So there is no delay between generation and consumption. And because of that, it's a very delicate dance, the balance between the generation of power and the consumption of power. In fact, power plants have to, communicate a predicted load to the national authority every morning. And if they generate anything more or less, they're actually fined because that negatively impacts the grid. point here is all of these power plants, if you pull out one or two from a grid, it's a huge impact. You pull megawatts or perhaps gigawatts of power out of the grid, and suddenly things start going a little unstable, yeah? The grid can crash because you suddenly just pull out a lot of load. So anyway, they fixed this, they secured it. Back to the actual power plant that I was contracted to pen test. So I'm out there on site, middle of nowhere, um, start to poke around the radios, yeah? So figure out that there's a long distance radio communication happening across two sort of units on the power plant. I'm not going to go into more detail. So picked up the radio link, figured out the device at the other end. Turns out it had a vulnerability that was publicly disclosed. Now these guys hadn't caught it. So anyway, if you look at the ICS kill chain, I fixed my goal. My goal was to compromise the physical process. In this case, it was to pull the power plant out of the grid. So the power plants all have a switch yard which sort of connects the generation to the transmission. It plays with the voltage, aligns it with the transmission grid and pumps it out there. My goal was to cut those relays and stop the power plant from basically transmitting power. And then from that goal, I sort of worked back. Spent a lot of time in study, did some wireless reconnaissance, exploit available. And that was a device which if I exploited, it would not have had an impact. Got the necessary permissions, exploited it. Got onto a segment of the actual power plant network. So now once you're there, you can't run Nmap, okay? These are things you don't do. You don't get into a power plant, pull out your laptop and run Nmap, because you will break everything, okay? A lot of these devices are very sensitive, and if you send malformed TCP packets, they die. And it is very hard to bring them back up, because booting them involves, it's a sequence, yeah? It's like a human body. It's a very complex sequence of things working together. They have to be booted in a very specific order. So anyway, you don't want to go in there and start running tools. So it's all passive. Luckily, the device I had a foothold on was a networking device. There were multiple interfaces. Something as simple as a TCP dump. Just sit and sniff for a day, understand who's talking to what they're doing, what protocols are on there. Anyway, I figured out the segment of network I was on, and I noticed a very interesting thing. There was a network time server. Now, operational technology environments typically have to be very synchronized to a clock, a very regular beat, because all these pieces of technology are working together, and they need to have timing down to millisecond accuracy. So they're typically synchronized with a GPS time server. There's antennas out there which shoot signals between the satellite, and by calculating the reflection time, you have a very accurately synchronized clock. So anyway, there was a server doing this. I figured out what it was doing, got access to that network server, poked at it a bit, found a 0 day on it. It was not a very difficult to find one. I'm just saying, calling it a 0 day, a fancy term, because it was not publicly available, the exploit. Took permission, got onto that device. Now that device was bridging 5 networks. It had 6 NICs. So the air-gapped network, what the guy said was the air-gapped OT network, was no longer air-gapped. From outside, through a wireless link, hop to the next device. And now I'm inside. I have access to any of the 5 networks inside. And it took me about a couple of days to figure out which network I wanted to be on. The switchyard network. There were the Schneider MyCom bay controllers, which were sort of controlling the relays that send power out onto the grid. Those had a vulnerability. Now, obviously, that's something you won't exploit. But, that's endgame. Just for fun, they had a spare device. I asked them to plug it in, exploited it, got root on it. They run RTOS, and it's a real-time operating system. And from there, you could actually just switch off all the relays and cut power to the grid. So end-to-end cyber kill chain, achieved, a goal achieved. And more often than not, this is the situation. I've pen tested a lot of power plants, and very rarely have I come out empty-handed. So the sad truth is, we always think that guys who do this OT hacking. It involves some sort of a genius hacker, zero-day exploits, and I have stepped on the HDMI cable. I'm so sorry. Okay. Yeah. Stealthy persistence, exfiltration, custom ICS exploits and physical process takeover. We all want we want all of this, but the fact of the matter is, man, if you just read the publicly disclosed documentation of most of these OT attacks, it's ridiculous. There's like RDP ports open to the public internet. There are PLCs in read state where you can just switch the ladder logic program. Lot of default credentials, this is the sad truth of it. And what we need is more guys out there in technical OT sec. And the problem is there's a high barrier to entry on both sides. It's not easy to get into OT sec because where do you get all this tech to play with? The manufacturers are like, hey, you're not going to touch this. There's so many times that network time server that I exploited, I reported the 0 day to the manufacturer. They came back at me with a legal notice. They were like, who allowed you to do this? So I've given them the contract. I'm like, the power plant contacted me. They're like, the power plant has this device on rent from us. They don't own it. So technically this belongs to us and you could not have done that. And so I work with a lot of law enforcement and government. So I just made a few calls and I told them, guys, this device is in air traffic control rooms and this is what they've done. So they shut that thing down. I mean, they did the right thing. But yeah, there's a lot of pushback from manufacturers, unfortunately, that push away security researchers like all of us. That has to stop. So, pen testing a power plant, if you guys want to get into it, I would say toss the IT approach away. Don't go in there, run Nmap and your vulnerability tools and all. What I like to do is understand the process. And you need to sit with the automation engineering guys to do that. The people who've set up the plant and who are running it. Buy them lunch, sit down, ask them to explain the whole thing to you. Yeah, understand the process, the physical process. It's super, super important. And it's really easy. I know there's standards like the IEC 62443 and there's like tons of paperwork. I'm not saying that's bad, that's great and it's necessary. But if you're technically testing a OT environment, there's very simple questions you need to ask. Define bad. What is bad? If you're testing a chemical plant, probably the plant blowing up is bad. Yeah? Yeah, I know it sounds absolutely comical, but it's just true. Define bad. What is bad? Okay? So if it blows up, it's bad. Define the how. Okay, after you've defined what is bad, how does one make this blow up? Ask yourself that question. List it all out. Then assess the possibilities of the likelihood of the how. How likely is it that someone is going to make this thing blow up? Toss out the unlikely stuff, and you're there with the likely, how. And then, if to secure it, you just figure out what would it take to make that how very, very difficult or impossible. It's as simple as that. Now, I know I'm simplifying the process behind it, but once you dive into the technicalities of it, things really flesh themselves out. And yeah, it's super simple. Yeah, some other interesting findings. Now, I've gone and looked at a lot of power plants, and unfortunately, OT systems, they still are controlled by computers that run Windows XP, Windows 7. And there's reasons for that. It's not like people have been, non-diligent and not updated their systems for like 2 decades. There are reasons for it. It's a bit of a time check, yeah. But, on a lot of these air-gap networks, I've actually found double pulsar. Does anyone know what that is? Double pulsar? Well, it's an NSA rootkit. And that brings you to the question, what the hell is an NSA rootkit doing on air-gapped networks and power plants? What's going on there? How did it get there? Supply chain? Sabotage? Who knows? But in more than one power plant, I found this stuff. So anyway, it was developed by the NSA, but it was leaked, and it became a publicly available exploit. It was leaked by this group called the Shadow Brokers. They are rumored to come from China, but anyway, no one really knows. So, whenever I've looked inside these networks, I've found stuff that really shouldn't be there. it's like a struggle for power from many different parties on the inside of these networks. And yeah, these are the battlegrounds of future wars. OSINT and Opsec fails. Another huge thing, there's people who work in these power plants and SCADA centers posting selfies of themselves on Twitter, posting LinkedIn profiles describing the kind of equipment that that they sort of operate as part of their job. I've used all of that information to compromise these systems. And here's a huge fail from none other than Donald Trump. So in 2019, basically, there was a space vehicle that had to be launched by Iran, and this vehicle blew up. Boom! It blew itself to smithereens on the launch pad. Now, half an hour within this thing exploding, Donald Trump tweets a pretty high resolution picture of the wreckage saying, the United States had nothing to do with this. So everyone was like, okay. It's not out of character for Trump to do this, but the resolution of that picture is phenomenal. There was not supposed to be any sort of technology that could get that level of resolution. It could not have been a drone, because an American drone flying over Iranian airspace, that would cause a brow or two to raise. So the OSINT community kicked into action. It took them 2 hours to figure out that basically what they did is there's an OSINT database, there's an open database of satellites that orbit the Earth. They looked at the angle of the shadows and the time of day that this thing was put out, and they calculated where the satellite might have been in order to click this picture. And it turned out that there was a satellite there. They just didn't identify what it was, but because of his tweet, he declassified $1 billion military spy satellite. That's all it took. And the very notion of a secret spy satellite is that it should be secret, right? Now that everyone knows what the orbit pattern is and where it is, it's easy to hide from it. You can't go and change a satellite's orbit pattern. Well, you can, but I mean, people are following it now. So yeah, OPSEC is huge. In OT environments, I've seen people go and, put a lot of stuff out there which they shouldn't. I want to talk a bit about Maritime as well. I know there's just about 10 minutes remaining. I'm going to throw the floor open to questions and stuff. So I do a lot of Maritime as well, which is why I'm in Singapore. I started hacking ships around 4 years back, again as a hobby. And then it sort of translated into a professional realm. And now our company builds security products for Maritime. That's another story. So anyway, piracy, modern piracy. Ships are basically floating ICS systems. When you show me a ship, I just see a factory that's floating on the sea. It's got a bunch of networks on it. It's got like the ship network for regular emails, business. It's got the crew network for families to, tweet, send WhatsApp messages, upload pictures of cats, what have you not. It's got the Navcom, which is, the navigation equipment, your GPS, your charts, ECDIS. Over-the-air updates coming to those systems. We've got communications, which are a whole bunch of radios up front, AIS, VHF, GSM. Today there's LTE, 5G. They've got loading and stability networks. Those of you familiar, there's EDIFACT, there's ballast networks, and of course there's the PLCs and HMIs that govern a lot of processes in the ship, from engines to pumps and whatever else. So yeah, the ship is a huge, huge network. It's super hackable. And in my opinion, not got enough attention from the security community. There are a few conferences, that host events like the CTF, the C being SEA, the CTF, where, they actually have a boat that you hack and take over. But, not too much out there. Now, that was an old ship's network. As of today, again, automation is kicking in to save costs. They're putting in computers to upload all of this data to the cloud, figure out how to make it more fuel efficient. And there's crazy stuff, nowadays with 5G ports and all. There's like just-in-time arrival, where the port is sending data to all the ships about, the availability of berths where the ships can come and dock. Ships are consuming this data and throttling engines in real time to reach a port just in time, because if you reach early, you got to anchor, and anchoring costs money. So at the end of the day, in order to save costs, they're putting in huge amounts of automation. And how secure is that? It's a question mark. It's not like I'm saying it's insecure. Yes, I have found a lot of things insecure, but I really think these sort of things could use more of people like us, coming in there and hacking these systems and making them more secure. Um, we're moving towards fully autonomous. Today, there are ships out there in the world which sail with just one or two people, and everything else is managed by computers. So, again, super hackable. High implications. You've got human life, environment, there's geopolitical stuff, healthcare, like all the vaccines are transmitted globally by ships. So it's high impact. That's not confirmed to be a cyber attack. It may or may not have been, but the image is just to sort of put it out there. What are the attack vectors on a ship network? Well, I've shown you the Purdue model, and I've talked about power and energy. This is very similar. You've got a sort of Purdue model on a ship as well. There's a ton of different attack vectors. It's ridiculous if you actually go there and start poking around the networks. Yeah, I'm going to actually end this and turn it into an interactive session for the last 5 minutes. Yeah. So basically, there's a lot to be done. We need more security professionals in the OT realm, deep tech guys, deep tech people out there, working hands-on. Some cool places to get started. I like this blog by Robert Lee. And I was going to put a whole bunch of stuff here. I don't know where it's gone, but you know what? I'm going to actually put it up on the Discord channel, all the resources to get started, hands-on in ICS security. How to build your own lab, get cheap stuff off eBay, set stuff up, start hacking stuff. That's the way to do it. You got to get your hands dirty. You got to understand the protocols. You got to be careful. And at the end of the day, enjoy yourself. You can reach me on LinkedIn, and that's my email address, which is really, really faint, so it's hard to see. But, I'm here. I'm at the radio hacking booth for the rest of the day. Any questions or anything anyone would like to say? Yes, please.
Hi, Karan. My name is AJ Sorasa from OT ISAC. So I appreciate what you've shared, the importance of securing the critical assets itself. I think before I go to my question, I'd like to add to what you've shared earlier. When it comes to ICS or OT cybersecurity, just to add that you need to equip, yourself to engineering knowledge because it's two discipline. ICS and OT is a two discipline that that you should acquire off. The engineers knows the best of their equipment, but they're not equipped to secure. They're equipped to produce. IT security, they're equipped to secure. So I think if you want to go, or if you want to shape your ICS or OT, you need to go into some of the resources on the engineering as well. OT ISAC, we're a nonprofit, so we do provide resources in ICS as well. I'm a big fan of Robert Lee. Just a question from my side from your earlier presentation. Was there any incidents that you have encountered personally, have you ever handled that a vulnerability from such equipment was exploited? Because in ICS you don't need malware, you just need to exploit vulnerabilities. Was there anything that you have seen for the last 18 months? And if it's okay, you can share, and how was it being exploited? Yeah.
It's always being exploited, and malware or no malware. I mean that's just a modality, right? When you say it can be exploited, what I think what you're trying to say is the legitimate functionality of the device can be abused or tuned out of safe operational parameters, and yeah, I've seen it being exploited. I've seen stuff basically in terms of denying availability of these systems. And what you said earlier was also absolutely important. You can't really tackle this from an IT mindset, which is why in my 101, I know I oversimplified it, but I can't stress more importantly on the fact that you need to sit and learn from the automation engineers. The guys who've built it and the guys who run it, they know it all. So you're absolutely right. You need to have a deep understanding of the physical process and the engineering process. And yes, these things are being exploited in the wild all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, okay, just now you share about the air gap networks, sometimes not really being air gap, right? Because there are some devices that you can pivot to. But let's say if the organization actually has an air gap, probably they are delivering, maybe sending some data through data diodes or whatever, right? In those cases, how do you actually do the testing for the secure network? Because you are not really allowed to put anything inside the OT network, right? No devices, nothing. You cannot connect your laptop to the network and then run or sniff something if you cannot pivot. So have you faced some situations like that before, and how did you overcome it?
Well, if the kill chain that I spoke about was an engagement where they had already, secured it and they wanted to test the security from outside. But most of the time, it's more of a white box engagement where we sit with the automation engineers and, with the permission of the authorities and the owners and the stakeholders of the power plant, be it state or private, they do allow us to connect sanitized laptops to a span port or a tap port and passively out of band listen to the traffic on the network. And in those scenarios, the wise way to test the efficacy of a data diode would actually be trying to send a control packet from one host on one network to another host and vice versa, and just validating that the diode is actually enforcing a unidirectional flow of data. And even if those are in place, there are out-of-band ways to attack systems. In fact, in a very small way, in the radio workshop, we were just having some fun with, using computer speakers to, send data out. And there are ways of, modulating the rate of spin of a hard disk, or, even the way voltage runs through the CPU. You can actually get the radio reflections out of it and decode data in a system. Now, I'm not saying all of this has a practical impact, but there are ways of, out of band access to such systems.
Sure. I was coming more from we had some experiences when we try to do some testing for these kind of environments. The problem is same thing, right? The IT and OT difference in mindset. So the OT guys, their priority is availability, everything. They have the compliances that they need to follow. So they were pretty resistant, even to for us to test the network. They're not willing to change any firewall rules. They're not allowing us to put anything. So that was
No, it's very important to win their confidence. That's why I said you need to really buy them lunch. Sit down with them and make them feel that you understand their process and you respect their process and you understand this is their domain. But at the same time, you need to make them aware that you come with a skill set and a mindset that they will not have. And it's perhaps better that you do this in their supervision rather than the bad guys come in and do it without anyone's supervision. And once they understand that, they're pretty open.
Yeah, sometimes it's more of the hardware vendors as well. So sometimes, even though they are willing to open up, but they are hardware vendors, if you let somebody do this, you're going to void a warranty or whatever.
I know. I faced a lot of this, and like I told you, I pawned a device and I informed them responsibly, and they came back with a legal notice. This happens, and this has to stop happening. They need to open their doors up to security researchers so we can, come in there, fix the problems before the bad guys get in there and break stuff. That's
Totally agree.
That's what needs to happen. All right, I think the time is up, right? The moderators, yeah. Any more questions? Cool. If there are, I'll be at the radio hacking booth. Just drop in, have a cup of coffee, maybe grab a drink in the evening or something. Thank you all, and see you later.